Stan Gibilisco here, amateur radio station W1GV, Whiskey 1 Golf Victor, although I rarely use those phonetics on the air because I operate almost exclusively CW and occasionally PSK 31. By the way, you'll find me most often on the 20-meter band running 10 watts output of CW or 7 big watts output on PSK 31. But I don't transmit much anymore. I just like to listen. I like to do some code practice from W1AW now and then. Just make sure I can still copy a good solid minute at 20 words a minute back in the day when I took my extra class test and they made me write that down letter for letter. They made me transmit too. They made me send too. And they made me send for a solid minute. Well, that's just a little reminiscing. Here is the station I had back in the early 1970s when I was in high school. Here is the transmitter up here. This was a Drake T4X transmitter. The receiver was a Drake R4A receiver. And TR switch connected them. This was a Johnson TR switch. Remember EF Johnson Company? They made those good old antenna tuners and transmit receive switch, which allowed me to operate full break-in CW back in that old day. What I've drawn here, though, with the transmitter is a little bit of a modified diagram, because the Drake T4X was able to transmit on AM, and it didn't have any audio filters or radio frequency filters in the AM transmitter. So if you overmodulated, you would get horrific splatter with that particular radio. I don't believe I ever used it on AM. It had a reduced carrier mode on AM that helped to save these vacuum tubes from being overstressed. They were two, I believe they were called 6JB6 vacuum tubes. Two of them in parallel ran 200 watts on CW, 200 watts input, or about 100 watts output, 200 watts PEP SSB, and 100 watts or so PEP on AM, although it had this reduced carrier, so that when you weren't talking, the carrier was reduced in power. Anyway, that was the way I set this radio up. And I drew this here with amplitude modulation mode for a reason. I got it into my head. I remember reading about very low frequency receivers. In particular, there was a station that I wanted to listen to. I heard about a WWVL. That looks kind of weird, doesn't it? That looks like an extended W, but really it's WWVL. One of the, they called it back then the National Bureau of Standards. I think now they call it something else, National Institute of Standards and Technology or something. But it had a frequency, it transmitted on a frequency of 20 kilohertz. And they had in one of the ham radio magazines, I believe it was QST, a design for a radio that would receive down in this range. And it was a very, very elaborate radio. It seemed that it was awfully cumbersome. And it was dedicated exclusively to the very low frequency, or VLF, band. That particular band, VLF, extended by definition from 10 to 30 kilohertz. So it included WWVL. Some texts will say 3 to 30 kilohertz, but generally below 10 kilohertz, there's very little of, if any, transmission done. I think maybe 9 kilohertz. Back in the day, 1970s, there was nothing below 9 kilohertz. There was no allocations at all below 9 kilohertz. But I became interested in receiving these very low frequencies. I wanted to hear what was down there. But I didn't want to build that radio, and it seemed like you had to tune several circuits one by one to make them track with each other. You had to kind of track them manually, and it seemed like a real difficult thing to do. So I thought, I wonder what would happen if I took this Drake T4X right up here. I believe the X was capitalized. Drake T4X. That was my transmitter. And down here was the R4A, and I remember the A was not capitalized. Now why they called them this? Well, the Collins radios were called pretty exotic things too. They still have exotic, arcane designators for these pieces of equipment. But this was my R4A T4X. This transmitter had an interesting feature. You could tune it into something called spot mode. Spot, S-P-O-T. To spot your transmitter frequency. Because this was a separate receiver, and if you wanted to operate them in the separate transmitter receiver mode, which I almost always did on CW, you would spot, and that would allow you to locate where your transmitter signal was going to be without actually sending anything out over the air. The interesting thing about that spot mode was that if you did that in AM, you would get an AM signal, but the driver and the power amplifier would be in effect cut out of the circuit. So you weren't using those. You were simply using the oscillator, the amplitude modulator, and you could talk into the microphone, and you could actually make a little AM signal that didn't go out over the air, but you could hear it in your receiver. Of course, you'd want to use a headset, not a speaker, because otherwise you'd get feedback back into the microphone. But I thought, I wonder what would happen if I took the microphone out of the radio, and this had a funny sort of a non-standard sized jack to plug into the transmitter. It was smaller than a 1/4 inch, but bigger than 1/8 of an inch. I don't know why they did that. My antenna was, back in that day, as it is today, a 1/4 wave vertical antenna for 20 meters on the house, on the roof of the house, with radials. I wondered what would happen if I took the antenna and plugged it into the microphone jack of the T4X. Thereby, whatever came in on this antenna would modulate this transmitter in spot mode, and I could listen to the sidebands by tuning to the carrier and then up and away from it 5, 10, 15, 20 kilohertz either side of the carrier. And I wondered whether or not, if I tuned 20 kilohertz above or below this carrier, I would hear WWVL. Well, I did that. I plugged this antenna into the microphone jack of my T4X, and I put it in spot mode. And I remember I had my good friend George over, and we tested it, and we tuned, and we heard stuff either side of the carrier, and it was obviously stuff meant for radio transmission. It sounded like radio teletype, most of it. Up around 17 kilohertz, there was an extremely strong signal. And down near the carrier, of course, if you got too close to the carrier, it would overwhelm the receiver with the carrier. But just above and below the carrier, there was an awful lot of AC noise. But that faded out around, about 9 kilohertz or so. I guess that's why they don't allocate below 9 kilohertz. There are other reasons I could get into. The VLF band has very interesting propagation characteristics, much, much different than anything at the high-frequency ham radio bands. Anyhow, so we did this, and we heard these signals, and I tuned 20 kilohertz above. I believe this was on 80 meters. There was, of course, no antenna connected anymore into the system, so the receiver wasn't hearing anything from over the air on the 80-meter band. 3.5 megahertz. Put this thing right on 3.5 megahertz and tune the R4A up and away from 3.5 up to 3.5020, 20 kilohertz above 3.5 megahertz. And what do you suppose we heard? It was 20 dB over S9, this thing. 20 dB over S9, and the noise level was maybe S7 or S8. This thing was receiving WWVL and a whole bunch of other stuff. And it was really easy to hear it. And it was just amazing. And I remember George and I just jumped up and down. We thought, you know, when you do an experiment, you don't know what's going to happen. That's the beauty of it. That's why scientists and engineers do these kinds of zany, offbeat experiments. Because sometimes schemes like this actually work, and in this case it did, and it was just one of the coolest things I've ever done with these radios. I did a lot of other hacks and mods with these radios, but this was one of the coolest ones. That and the notch inverter. I also built my own radio teletype terminal unit and modulator. That was a hoot as well. Anyway, you can still do that kind of stuff with ham radio, by the way. There's no law against it. No law against building your own radios as long as they meet the emissions requirements. Stan Gibilisco, W1GV, Whiskey 1 Golf Victor, ham radio operator, old timer, signing off from the Black Hills of South Dakota, United States of America. 73.